I think it's perfectly fine to say that the government deficit is the private sector, domestic private sector surplus plus the foreign sector surplus.
Great.
And that deficits and surpluses cancel out. I think that's fine. I don't know why we have to write loads of equations down. We're not doing an exam on it.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. For as little as $1 a month, you can get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. A big thank you to all our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, economist and author, Dr. Stephen Hale. And we're going to be talking to him in a moment about imports and exports and the effect they have on a nation's balance sheet using what's known as the sectoral balance framework. If this is your first time hearing about MMT, this is probably not the episode to go in on. And so in the show notes, I've linked to our first 3 episodes where me and Patricia lay out MMT basics in a hopefully easy to understand way. The reason we think understanding MMT is important is because it changes the conversation about government spending. The MMT view is that currency issuing governments such as those of the UK, the US, Japan, Canada and Australia cannot run out of their own money, and that the money itself is a policy tool for shifting real resources into public sector use to provision the public purpose. What that public purpose is a matter for ideally democratically governed people to decide in a hopefully democratic way. But the MMT framework for understanding the issuance and function of currency applies equally, whether you're in a democracy like, say, Bolivia, or an autocracy like, say, the USA. In short, if you're living in a country with a modern money system, when you understand how that system works and why it exists, it's hard to argue that any useful purpose is being served by austerity-fueled hardship or involuntary unemployment. And understanding MMT is the way you get to make the case for addressing these literally life and death issues. And just for the purposes of calming your inner fiscal conservative, let me just say that MMT is not an argument that governments can spend unlimited amounts of money without consequence. It's about replacing a purely financial constraint with a real resource constraint. Another way of saying this is if something is physically possible, and if the real resources exist to do it, and if those resources are priced in your national currency, then it can be afforded by the issuer of that currency, which is the government. Again, the decision whether or not to spend on a particular item and have real resources devoted to it is a matter for hopefully democracy, and governments can, for want of a better word, overspend. But the evidence of government overspending is not a deficit. It's inflation. And you can listen to our episode 65 with Phil Armstrong if you want more detail on that. So, in this conversation, you'll hear us talking about the sectoral balance accounting identity, which I've written in the show notes so you can see what it looks like written down. And as you'll hear, this accounting identity goes like this. G minus T equals S minus I plus M minus X. Don't worry about the algebra, because Stephen is great at explaining these things. But I bring this up because you'll hear me ask Stephen about how government spending relates to private sector savings. And that relationship between the government and the private sector, before we add in the foreign or external sector, is described as G minus T equals S minus I. So that's G, government spending, minus T, taxes paid back to the government, is equal to S, private sector savings, minus I, which is private sector investment spending. Now, as you'll hear, I'm still trying to get my head around private sector investment spending. And the reason for that is that this equation seems to say that private sector investment spending takes away from private sector savings. But it still seems to me, even on reflection, that if I spend for investment to buy, say, a computer to make podcasts, that's investment spending for me, as opposed to if I buy some takeaway fast food, that's consumption spending. But the way I see it, when I spend for investment, I don't pay the computer itself. I pay a person or people. And so that spending surely ends up as savings in someone else's bank account. And if they don't save it, it ends up as savings in another person's bank account. And at the moment, I can't see any other way around this. So you'll hear me puzzle over this again in a future episode. And at the time of recording, this still seems to be a bit of a roadblock for me. So for those of you who can easily see the error in my thinking, thanks in advance for bearing with me as I wrestle with this. But in any event, as you'll hear in the interview, none of what I've just said negates the MMT perspective that government spending minus taxes paid back to the government, in other words, the government deficit, equals the non-government surplus, or the net financial assets of the non-government sector. On another note, you'll hear us talk about the work of another one of our favourite guests, John T. Harvey, whose area of expertise is exchange rate theory, and one of our recent episodes is a presentation he gave on that very topic, and that's our episode 64. And the great news is that we'll be talking to John again about this stuff in a couple of episodes' time. And I should just add that that recent John Harvey episode was made possible by a collaboration with our friends at Modern Money Australia. So check them out if you want to get involved in the MMT movement down under, and also listen to the Unemployed Workers Fight Back podcast, who have great MMT guests, and be sure to check out the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group website. There are links to all of the above in the show notes, along with a link to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month, which is 76 British pence at the time of recording. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. Your financial support really helps keep this show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just listening and thinking about this stuff, is the way we get to keep pushing the conversation forward and help people to understand that better is possible. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding and spreading the word about MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I am Patricia Pina.
And it's a pleasure to welcome back to the show the MMT rock star who will refute all allegations of being an MMT rock star due to, I'm going to say, a deeply ingrained Britishness. It's Dr. Stephen Hale. Welcome back, Stephen.
Oh, thanks very much. That's very nice. Very kind of you. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. I'm good.
I'm very good. I'm very pleased to see you.
I was going to say, it looks from over here that the MMT lens, the empowerment it brings to social and economic and environmental justice movements is spreading really well over there in Australia, thanks in no small part to you and an amazing team that's ever growing. Do you want to give us an update on the MMT sustainable prosperity scene over there?
Well, things are changing to the point that there are some things that we can't say anymore. So some people are listening to us that you can't talk about in public, which is great. That wasn't the case not long ago. But what's happened over the last 6 months to a year, it goes back before the pandemic, really. We had to build up to a great conference in January. More than 400 members of the public, really, activists, people in political parties, people that weren't in political parties, people in environmental groups, trade unionists from all over Australia. We had a few people coming internationally as well. They all turned up in Adelaide on the 10th of January, and for 3 long days, nobody left, hardly anyone anyway, left before the end, listened to a series of talks. And we had Professor Mitchell with us. We had Stephanie Kelton over, who is, I suppose, a colleague of mine this year because she's a visiting professor at the University of Adelaide all year. Not that she's in Adelaide now. Of course, we had Andres Bernal, who some people will remember, who's an advisor to AOC. We had another MMT economist from America, Mike Murray from Newcastle, Martin Watts, and that's Newcastle in New South Wales, and and James Juniper. And we also invited some of Australia's and, in a couple of cases, the world's leading ecological economists too, because we were trying to bridge some gaps there, or at least get these people talking to each other, including Robert Costanza, who is in Canberra at the Australian National University now, but used to be at the University of Vermont. So had some indirect links via Bernie to Stephanie. Of course, that was absolutely great. And while she was here, Stephanie was interviewed by virtually every newspaper in Australia and did TV, various radio programs. And I got to look over her shoulder as she was just finishing the edit on her book. That was great while she was here too. Of course, since then, obviously, people like Bill Mitchell have been working hard in Australia, but globally, we've had Stephanie and her book as well, and all the publicity which has come from that. And Stephanie has stayed engaged in Australia. So she's still talking to Australian journalists and politicians. She's been a great help. And we've had a long series of things in the media. Even I've been on TV. So it's just something I didn't expect to happen. And we are, I think, finally getting somewhere in terms of the national narrative. And there are at least some politicians in Canberra who are now talking to us, and ideas like a federal job guarantee. I don't think the present government's going to go that way anytime soon, but they're on the agenda. And now I think the next election in Australia is going to have not just climate change, but also full employment. So, yeah, things are moving on.
Yeah.
The only thing I forgot to say is that some of this is down to the world's best organiser, whose name is Gabrielle Bond, who organised the whole conference and everything since, including the webinars. We must have had 15 or 20 webinars since then, with a huge variety of speakers, MMT, economists, feminist economists, ecologists, other people as well. And it's just kept things bubbling along, really.
Yeah, so shout out to Gabrielle Bond, obviously, and we'll link to those webinars. I imagine are on the YouTube channel of because you have a website, don't you?
We do. This has completely outgrown me now, so this is nothing to do.
Yeah.
Well, it is sort of in that I say, oh, well done. But I'm not actually done anything about it. The conference website is still going, and all the videos of all the talks at the conference are still there. And I think the webinars are still on that site, something like mmtadelaide2020.com or something like that, the address is. But yes, there is a new Sustainable Prosperity Action Group, that's what we're calling it. And there's a new website there. But yes, it's Gabrielle and her team who are doing that, and they're all doing it for nothing. Nobody's being paid. We don't have a budget.
Yeah, great. It's the power of spreading the MMT knowledge. It makes people go, I have to do something with this.
You and Bill Mitchell must be both extremely busy at this moment, which is great news for us.
We are. Obviously, Bill is busy at a different level to us, and I can't claim to know what he's up to, and I'm sure quite a lot of it isn't public anyway. It's sort of team MMT, so although you don't know what everyone else in the team is doing, but everybody is pushing in the same direction. And what I can see happening now is a lot of younger people are coming along, which is difficult because you have to do the mainstream courses, at least in Australia, and I think this is true in the UK too. There are no modern monetary theory oriented postgraduate programs. But there are a lot of young people who are either coming through or have come through the mainstream training who are now becoming prominent with modern monetary theory. Quite a few government economists in both the federal government and state governments who I hesitate to name on a podcast like this. Lachlan is the first name of one of them who you might have come across, who have been absolutely amazing and are shifting both the Greens and the Labour Party. And I think in another 5 years, people like me will be able to not do so much. By then, there's going to be a lot of them. And it is genuinely the case. I think we are on the brink of something really important in terms of how we think about economics shifting. And it's really nice to see so many younger people they've already got their expertise, or most of it. They don't have the paper qualifications yet. And when you can put doctor in front of your name, for some weird reason, people want to put you on the radio and publish things you say in the newspaper and stuff. So you need the paper qualifications. But I think there's a whole generation coming along.
The first time I met Bill Mitchell, our first meeting, he said to me, people ask me where I should study economics. And I always say, don't study economics. And now, obviously, as things have progressed, that has changed slightly, but the objectives are different.
I know what he means, but I don't have to agree with him on everything. And I profoundly disagree with him on that, because unless people study economics, as Joan Robinson said a long time ago, they're going to continue being fooled by economists. You have to, and you have to understand, and will for some time, the neoclassical framework thoroughly if you're going to effectively offer an alternative to it. So I don't say that.
Isn't it funny, we're talking about all this ideological rigidity, and people think economics is a science, or it's akin to a science. There's stuff out there to discover, there's stuff out there to evolve, and you would have thought, if it was a science, people would have gone, oh great, a new challenging idea that's disproved my theory. Great, our discipline has just evolved because somebody's just disproved something.
Yeah.
Let's get on, where is it that doesn't happen?
Well, that's what Warren Mosler thought, didn't he, 25 years ago?
Yeah.
He didn't think it'd take 25 years for people to start listening. But
so anyway, to that end, given that academia is what it is around economics, it falls to us to make some sense of sectoral balances. We wanted to pick your brains about the external sector, because that's something that comes up when people get a bit further into MMT as activists and interested people. And we had a question that came up from one of our patrons in this area, and it kind of stumped us. So we thought, who better to talk to than Dr. Stephen Hale?
Well, probably several, but I'll do my best.
So if we talk sectoral balances for a moment, let's ignore the external sector. We have the government deficit is the private sector's surplus, which is what MMTers are very familiar with now. Or if the government's in surplus, then the government surplus equals the private sector deficit.
That's right.
But most of the time, government's in deficit. So to me, government spending minus taxes paid back to the government equals private sector savings. So that's about right so far, eh?
No, not quite. It's but that's a quirk with national income accounting definitions. It's not a problem with your understanding. The government deficit is the net acquisition of financial assets by the private sector. Now, when you talk about saving is defined as the difference between our disposable income and our consumption. For a moment, imagine that there wasn't a government and there was no foreign trade. Then our income would have been generated as a result of producing things which we could have divided up between consumer spending and investment. And when we talk about investment in macroeconomics and in national income accounting, we mean the production of new capital goods. We're not talking about people buying shares. We're not talking about financial assets there. We're talking about plant, equipment, machinery, buildings, infrastructure. And we also include in our definition of investment additions to stocks and work in progress. So that's what we mean by investment. And the government deficit it's the net acquisition of financial assets in the private sector. But that's not the same thing as what we define as saving. It's the gap between our saving, that part of our income that we don't use for consumption, and our investment spending. And when we talk about investment spending, it's what I was just discussing that I might mean by investment spending. So when the private sector saves, it can acquire financial assets, but that saving can also be used to fund the purchase of real assets, equipment, machinery, buildings, etc. So the government deficit is private savings minus private investment. It's not quite the same thing as saying private savings, but that's not that your understanding was wrong. That's just a quirk of how we define things in the national income accounts.
Okay. Well, the way I had the question worded, so I'm trying to map what you just said onto the G minus T equals S minus I. That's what the sectoral balances look like if you take the external sector out. So what you've got is government spending minus taxes. On the other side of the ledger, you've got the non-government sector. I thought that meant it equals private sector savings. G minus T equals S. But when you look at it, it's G minus T equals S minus I.
That's right.
And to me, given that somebody's spending is somebody else's income, whether it's consumption spending or investment spending, how is I anything other than zero?
Well, I is what I was just not very well explaining is. If we have no external sector, then you can think of national income being divided up by the different types of spending which contribute towards national income, or by what that national income is then divided up between. So the different types of spending which contribute towards national income are consumer spending and investment spending and government spending. And that income is then divided up between, well, we pay taxes, and what we don't pay taxes we use for consumer spending, and what's left over we save. Now, the expenditure and income approaches to national income accounting, which is what I was just talking about, basically they're just dividing up the same thing in different ways. So you'd have consumption plus savings plus taxation equals consumption plus investment plus government spending. You could then cancel out consumption from both sides of the equation. And if we were to rearrange, you'd get government spending minus taxation equals saving minus investment. Saving minus investment is the net acquisition of financial assets by the private sector, because what we save out of our income is partly used to fund new real estate or new purchases of capital equipment, investment spending, and it's the rest of it that's then being used to accumulate net financial assets.
Is it right to say that we should remember that these are flows and not stocks? And so savings would be the money that is being actively saved versus the money that is being actively taken out of savings or generated for the purpose of investment.
That's right. They're flows in the national income accounts. We're talking about things that are measured over time, and saving is basically a residual. Mm-hmm. So some of your income is taxed away, some of it you use for consumption, and what's left over we call saving. And that adds to your assets. You can use it to fund the acquisition of real assets like property or capital equipment that we call investment spending, or you can use it to fund the acquisition of financial assets. And where does the private sector get those additional financial assets from? If there's no foreign sector, the only place to get them from is the government. So yes, G minus T is equal to S minus I. The government deficit's the private sector surplus.
Okay. I'm going to have to think about this a bit further, but if we move on...
I'm sorry, I'm probably just not very good at explaining.
No, I absolutely don't apologise for that. It's it's me. Of course it's me. You're a doctor of economics.
Well, of course it's me. There's quite a few of them that can't explain anything at all, actually. Some of them don't understand anything at all.
Let's add in the external sector.
Yes.
So the way I think about the external sector is that the private sector is divided into the domestic private sector and the foreign private sector. Does that work, or is there? I'm sure there's more finesse to it, but
if it makes it easier to understand, it's fine. But the foreign sector includes all the foreign governments as well.
Sure.
Of course, it just includes the rest of the world. I think probably it's, unless you're addicted to algebra. It's enough just to talk about, I quite like it the way Stephanie does in the book with buckets.
The buckets, yeah, I love it.
You don't need to write G minus T equals S minus I plus N minus X. And then most people, when you do that, panic.
Yeah.
So they think, I can't remember what M is. Is it the money supply or is it input? And I think it's perfectly fine to say that the government deficit is the private sector, domestic private sector surplus plus the foreign sector surplus.
Great.
And that deficits and surpluses cancel out. I think that's fine. I don't know why we have to write loads of equations down. We're not doing an exam or anything.
But even though you've said all that, I'm gonna lean into the equation.
Yeah. Okay.
That you just brought up. So I'll say it again. G minus T equals S minus I plus M minus X. And because people are listening rather than looking at it, I'm going to say it in words. That's government spending minus taxes paid back to the government equals domestic private sector savings.
That's right.
Minus domestic private sector investment spending.
That's right.
And then we add in the external sector, which is M minus X, which is imports minus exports. So M would represent pounds flowing out of the country to buy imports. X would represent pounds flowing into the country to buy our exports. So if you're a net importer like the UK, M is bigger than X. So for the UK, our M minus X is a positive number. Does that sound okay?
Even that, I think, it ends up being perhaps unnecessarily complicated.
Okay.
First of all, the pounds aren't going anywhere.
Yes. Yeah.
As you know, although the ownership of the pounds might change, and it's not necessarily pounds at all. It could be in foreign currency as well. These transactions are taking place, although their value will be recorded in terms of pounds. But in Britain's balance of payments and national accounts. And secondly, just to confuse things even more, M minus X, technically is the trade deficit. And technically, when you're looking at financial flows, what needs to go there is something called the current account deficit, which is similar, but not quite the same.
I'm glad you say that, because we had a question which was specifically about this by Howell, about why do we speak, when we look at this equation or identity, why do we speak of exports and imports and not the current account?
Because otherwise it rapidly becomes more complicated, because the current account balance is the trade balance plus net primary and secondary income flows. And you then have to tell people what primary and secondary income flows are and talk about wages and interest and profit and dividends and rent and transfer payments, which are secondary income flows, and you have to explain what they are as well. And if you're not careful, and again, just to advertise the deficit myth again, Stephanie does this superbly well in the book, you lose the wood for the trees.
Yeah, I agree that you don't want to bore people. You want to say things in the most pithy way possible. And I think, things really did change for MMT, or what was called soft currency economics, when Warren Mosler thought, I've got to just start talking in English in short sentences about how this works, and wrote soft currency economics. I think the whole thing starts there, really.
It does. And that's one of the problems with, although I know it's wrong to say that absolutely everything in MMT is in Hyman Minsky, but quite a lot of it is, although he often contradicts himself later in life.
Yes,
Well, you try reading Minsky's books. Oh, my God. They are, sometimes when you read them, which is why it's better to read Why Minsky Matters by Randall Wray.
We need an intermediary.
That's right. It's as though he wrote the books to make them seem as complicated as possible, with as much jargon as possible, so that unless you were going to study properly, you wouldn't have any notion what he was talking about half the time. And he's one of my great heroes, Hyman Minsky. But yes, that one of the great strengths of the MMT economists from Warren onwards, and I think you can say this for all of them actually, is that they are great communicators, and you can read what they've written and you can actually understand it.
Yeah. With that context, like you say, yes, you don't want to bore people. You don't want to be in an audience of 200 people, mixed ability people talking about bond sales or reserve drain. That's why we do this podcast, because this is not 200 people, mixed ability. This is a self-selecting audience. And what happens is we discover MMT, and we start going, look, the way we're talking about government spending in our political discourse is wrong. It's not a bit wrong. It's exactly 180 degrees reversed. If there's unemployment, we need to grow the deficit, not shrink it. It's not evidence of a profligate government that's being irresponsible. Actually shrinking the deficit is the irresponsible thing to do right now.
And that's the really simple bit.
Yeah.
That's the bit. That's the important bit.
Yeah. But then where the road meets the rubber is, then you get people jumping in and going, oh, what about the foreign sector? What about M minus X? Blah, blah, blah. And we're trying to give people who are getting embroiled in those kind of discussions the framework to be able to debate on those terms. So that's why I don't shy away from sort of leaning into these things. But you're absolutely right. We want to be able to sort of sum it up in ways that, like, people can understand. So that's why we do it the way we do it, I think.
Okay, well, let's do current account then.
Okay, go on.
Okay.
You asked me about the current account and the capital and financial account. You asked me about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. So ask away.
Oh, great. Okay, all right. So where I got to is that if the external sector is M minus X, we're going to get to current account and capital account in a second, but let's build it up from here.
Yeah.
The external sector is M minus X. If you're a net importer like the UK, you guys in Australia are net exporters, but we're importers.
Well, we are now.
Yeah.
We haven't been most of the time in recent decades,
M's bigger than X if you're in the UK, so M minus X, positive number. So what that whole thing we just ran through is saying that if we want the UK domestic private sector to have net financial assets, positive net savings, and we happen to be a net importer, the government deficit, G minus T, has to be a positive number because it has to add up to our domestic private sector savings plus pounds held by the foreign sector. And they happen to both be positive numbers right now if we're importers. Does that sound about right?
That's right. If the UK is going to be running an external deficit, which is the same thing as saying the foreign sector on the UK monetary system is in surplus, and you want the domestic private sector to be in surplus, which both Wynne Godley and in a different way Hyman Minsky used to say is essential if you're going to have a stable and sustainable monetary system, then actually that means the government deficit has got to be bigger than the external deficit. It's got to be bigger than the foreign sector surplus because, as you know, surpluses and deficits over the three sectors always, by definition, are up to zero. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So it is unsustainable for the UK government to run a budget surplus. Because
net private sector debt is unsustainable over the long term.
Well, if we assume the trade deficit doesn't disappear and doesn't become a trade surplus, then and the government can perhaps influence the external balance, but it can't determine it, then the only way for the government to be anywhere close to balancing its budget or running a surplus in the UK would be for the private sector to go into deficit. And if the private sector was being forced into deficit, then while it is possible to imagine a boom in business investment being the driving factor for that, it's most unlikely that that's going to be the case in the UK in the foreseeable future. So in fact, what it would be instead, what you'd be relying on instead is the household sector going even further into debt than it is at the moment. And that would potentially be associated with even more of a bubble in property prices than there had been up until now. And you'd end up with even more fragile financial system, which would probably eventually crash. And that we've gone further down that road in Australia than you have in the UK, actually. We have more household debt here than the UK does. For exactly that reason. Government's not running high enough deficits and relying on resting the economy on the back of household debt.
A lot of the recent booms in the UK and the US were that, really. I remember in the UK, it was characterised as, and I think it's a pretty good characterisation, that people using their homes as ATMs.
Yeah, well, Australia has the world's second highest household debt to GDP ratio. Only Switzerland has more household debt compared to its income than we do.
And how difficult is it to reverse that? Because I heard as well that if the private sector is in deficit and heavily indebted, and you want to get rid of that, make the system stable, and you start spending or give it, or say forgiving debt, then people may just use that money instead of paying down their debt. If they get additional income, they might use it to spend it more on imported televisions or imported products. And that is not something that is easy to control. Is that something that...
Well, I think the first thing that I would want to do is I'd want to ensure that we maintained sustainable full employment over time. And I would be tightening up on financial regulation in a variety of ways, including eliminating borrowing based on the use of financial assets as collateral and borrowing for speculative purposes on financial markets, which would be one way of bearing down on further accumulation of household debt. over time, I'd also look to further tighten up on mortgage lending, particularly investment mortgages, and eliminate interest-only mortgages, and invest in more affordable housing over time and attack things that way. I don't think there's going to be a debt jubilee. I love Steve Keen as well. He's another great economist, but I don't agree with him on that. I just don't think that's the most feasible way to go forward. But I do think it's important to shift our focus away from a reliance on even more household debt in the future to support the economy, and move towards a fiscal deficit to support the economy and allow people over time to service their debt, because interest rates are going to be low and stable the way we're going to run the financial system. We're going to maintain full employment, and we hope over time people will be able to pay down their own debt.
Okay, let's just recap where we got to with imports and exports. You kind of said this earlier, but I'll just say it my way and see if it works for you. When UK residents and firms buy imports, pounds don't leave the country. So if somebody from overseas wants to hold pounds, they would have to have a pound denominated bank account at a bank, and that bank would have to have a reserve account at the Bank of England. And the pounds are just positive balances, spreadsheet entries on the Bank of England spreadsheet. So when we say pounds are flowing out of the country, what we're actually saying is the ownership of those pounds has changed hands from a UK resident or firm to a non-UK resident individual or firm. Does that sound accurate? Or I'm sure there's some. I'm sure I've oversimplified.
Well, it does. I mean, you can make it more complicated because there's more than one way of talking about the money supply, and it depends on whether you're talking about the monetary base, which is basically currency plus bank reserve accounts at the Bank of England, or whether you're talking about a measure of the broad money supply, which makes things more complicated. But essentially, yes, that's true. And it's literally true always if you're talking about the monetary base.
Okay, cool.
So foreign exchange transactions don't create or destroy pounds.
Yeah.
They just change the ownership of pounds, and trade is one of the minor ways in which that cause foreign currency transactions to happen, as I'm sure John would have spoken to you about. Actually, the turnover of the foreign exchange market is over 100 times as big as the value of world trade anyway. So most funds that are moved from pounds to euros, or especially from euros to US dollars, are nothing directly to do with trading goods and services at all. But trade does cause some foreign exchange transactions, that's right. And when you talk about pounds leaving the country, actually, it's the ownership of the pounds that leaves the country.
Got it. Okay. So just channeling Warren Mosler, if as a nation you're a net importer, you've got a bunch of non-UK residents holding pounds, but instead of holding boring old pounds, they'd rather hold awesome pounds that pay people money just for having them, otherwise known as government bonds. So they go ahead and buy government bonds, which is the central bank moving your pounds from their boring pound account to their awesome pound account, or in other words, from the current account to the savings account. Is that still an all right metaphor?
Yeah, we could ban them from doing that, but there's no purpose to banning them from doing that, and we let them do it. Yeah, the foreign investors buy government bonds, government securities on the secondary market. We used to say they've gone from having non-interest-bearing pounds to interest-bearing pounds, but actually these days they've gone from interest-bearing pounds to other interest-bearing pounds, perhaps at a slightly higher rate of interest, but only marginally. You are basically swapping apples for very similar apples. When you swap reserve accounts at the Bank of England for Treasury bonds.
Okay, and the reason I bring that up is because if you don't use the MMT lens, the UK selling government bonds to non-residents gets characterised as foreigners lending the UK money.
Well, in a sense, they are. In that they're acquiring what for them are net financial assets in the UK monetary system, and the UK now has some financial liabilities, as Warren would say. All you owe them is a bank statement, but They could take those pounds and use those pounds to buy things from the UK, or they could swap the ownership of those pounds to somebody else, because they could approach a market maker on the foreign exchange market, and they could look to sell those pounds to buy euros or US dollars. The worst thing that could happen as a result of that is the pound would depreciate, which has happened, on and off in the last few years anyway, without catastrophic consequences. I'm not saying that it would, but that's
the worst case.
That's the worst thing that could happen. And that would not be catastrophic.
Yeah.
It's not going to cause anybody, it's not going to cause the British government to go bust. If the pound depreciated enough and there were British businesses that had foreign currency denominated debts where they'd not hedged the foreign exchange risk, it could cause problems for those businesses. Yeah. So I'm not going to say there are never any circumstances where there couldn't be problems for some people as a consequence of a significant depreciation in the pound. But you've lived through significant depreciations in the pound. As soon as there was the Brexit vote, the pound depreciated. It wasn't the end of the world. People started talking about Marmite costing a bit more. Yeah. I think that's about as much.
Marmite comes up a lot in these conversations. But, the reason I just wanted to sort of like recontextualize or reframe government selling bonds. When you apply the MMT lens, if you're in a net import country, you see it as we've got the stuff. The nation that exported the stuff has the spreadsheet entries. There's no problem. If they want to change boring pounds to awesome pounds, no problem. We issue pounds. We can't default on the obligations to move the pounds between these accounts, even with the interest. So it's not the case that we need non-UK residents to quote unquote lend us money to fund our consumption. It's that these overseas individuals, institutions decide to save in pounds. For now,
as long as you keep your own currency, which obviously Britain's going to do, and as long as you don't have a fixed exchange rate, and as long as the government has no significant foreign currency debt, then absolutely it's not a problem. If you were a low-income country that had an extraordinarily narrow range of exports and not well-developed financial markets, so there wasn't much of a market for the currency as far as the foreign exchange market was concerned, and you were heavily dependent on imported food and fuel that was priced in US dollars. If all those things were true, if you were to turn the UK into South Sudan or something, economically speaking, and that's not to denigrate low-income country like that at all, it's just to say that their circumstances are different, then the story would be different. But obviously that's not true of the UK, so no, there's not a problem.
Yeah. Okay. And you said earlier the worst thing that could happen is a depreciation in the currency,
which you've got lots of experience of.
Yeah, you've lived through it, and and these are different too, because people then go, well, isn't depreciation just like micro hyperinflation? And of course, we're saying no, that's it. Hyperinflation is a completely different phenomenon. We're talking about one-time adjustments in these things.
Let us have a fantasy. We'll have a fantasy. We go back in time and Jeremy Corbyn becomes elected Prime Minister. Regardless of the state at the time of Britain's balance of payments, the currency would have died when that became, because he wouldn't have been popular with the bankers trading pounds on the foreign exchange market. And there would have been the currency would have bounced back again later, but there would have been some downward pressure on the currency. Would it have created a crisis? No. Would some of my family have complained when they went on holiday to Spain? Maybe temporarily, but they would have got over it. All right, it wouldn't have been a big thing.
Because we saw that even with Trump's election. I think the that there was some heavy fluctuations in the U.S. currency. Obviously, the U.S. currency, the dollar, recovered pretty fast after when the businessmen actually realized what Trump's election meant. But I think it would be fair to say that with Corbyn, maybe the panic would have lasted a bit longer. But then when they actually saw the tangible benefits of the policies that he was proposing were being seen, then, that would recover pretty fast.
It wouldn't have been a crisis. And I think that people on the left in general are far more fearful than they need to be, especially the older ones that can remember the days when the British government foolishly wanted to try and prop up the pound when they perhaps shouldn't have done, and the IMF and 1976 and all that, they still sort of remember. There's a deep scar. The same thing is true in Australia, when there was a fixed exchange rate in the mid-70s, and we had a government here that was struggling to pass a budget, and then the Queen sacked the Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, and all that. So lefties over here, I say lefties, they're not as lefty as I am, but people that I call lefties over here, they still remember the Labour government of the mid-1970s and all the problems at the time when there were fixed exchange rates. And when you say to them, the world's changed now, we have a different monetary system, we don't have a fixed exchange rate anymore, it's not like that anymore, then it's very difficult to get that over to people. And people still go back to, it's 44 years ago. There's still the focus in Britain on Dennis Healey and the International Monetary Fund and all that.
Well, like the saying goes, one funeral at a time. That's the only way we're going to move this thing.
But I can understand why people are nervous, because there used to be crises in the olden days. You can go back even further than that. I think it was 1967. Jim Callaghan said, we'll devalue the pound over my dead body. And the next day they devalued the pound. And in those days, governments that devalued the pound tended to lose general elections. And indeed, Edward Heath won the 1970 general election. So these scars run deep. Britain doesn't have a fixed exchange rate anymore. It's a monetary sovereign government. The monetary system's very different. The economy's very different to what it used to be. And I do genuinely believe that people are overly concerned.
Is depreciation even the right word to use anymore? Should we maybe just use adjustment in the price of the pound?
Well, depreciation, I think, is the right word to use. With fixed exchange rates, we used to talk about a devaluation, which was when you reduce the policy rate. With the depreciation, it just goes down on the market. People sometimes still talk about devaluation. I tried to resist using that term when talking about exchange rates now that we have floating currencies. So
I was going to say, John Harvey has a nice way of summing it up. He just goes, devaluation is when the government does it, and depreciation is when the market does it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Although, of course, in real life, many governments around the world manage their currencies without having, strictly speaking, fixed exchange rates. And then you get people sometimes use one word and sometimes use another. But yes, the British government should be running as it is, but I mean, even when there's not a pandemic, should be running a large enough deficit so that it is possible to run the monetary system with the private sector being habitually in surplus, regardless of the desires that the rest of the world has to be in surplus with the UK, which is supporting your currency while you have an external deficit. And yet, I think that would be a better way to run the economy. That means relying more on fiscal policy and less on trying to encourage people to go further and further into debt. And not that I'm not in a position to state an official modern monetary theory answer to anything, but that's what I think.
I think you are, but I know we that's something that will never resolve. So I'm about to move us into the capital account, but just to get into the terminology. I love the way Stephanie Kelton says it in The Deficit Myth, and we're all huge fans of The Deficit Myth. The way Stephanie says it is, trade deficits are stuff surpluses. So if we're running a trade deficit, we've got the stuff. The nation that exported the stuff is holding pounds. The UK has what's called a current account deficit.
Yeah.
So is there more to the definition of current account deficit, or is it just another expression of the trade deficit?
Well, it's the trade deficit with a few odds and ends added onto it, yes. So suppose there was a trade surplus. So we're talking about the trade balance.
Okay.
If you take the trade balance and you add in all the wages and salaries, interest, profit, dividends, rent, and gifts or transfers that have come in to Britain, and you deduct all the stuff that's gone out, that's how you go from the trade balance to the current account balance. So they're very similar. Why we sometimes have made a distinction in Australia in the past is that it's often been the case in Australia, this was true up until last year, that we were running a trade surplus and a current account deficit. because although we were exporting more than we were importing, the fact that in previous years that hadn't been the case meant that a lot of interest payments were going out of the country. So you can have a trade surplus and a current account deficit at the same time. But for a long while, Britain has had both a trade deficit and a current account deficit. And if people want to regard them as the same thing, as long as they're not doing an A-level economics exam, it probably doesn't matter.
Okay. So that's the current account, right?
Yeah.
Then there's this thing called the capital account. First of all, what is capital, or what are capital assets in that context?
Goodness gracious me. Okay, I say goodness gracious me because there's two questions there, really. What is capital is quite a complicated and long question.
But in that context.
What is the capital account?
Okay.
If you were running a current account surplus, you have what we call a capital and financial account deficit. If you're running a current account deficit like Britain is, you have a capital and financial account surplus. That capital and financial account surplus is basically what MMT people call the foreign sector surplus on your financial system. Now, we used to just talk about the capital account, but some years ago, for reasons that I can't even remember, the International Monetary Fund redefined what everybody and still a lot of school teachers used to call the capital account, redefined almost all of it as the financial account. And they took a couple of really unimportant elements of it out separately and named that the capital account, which confuses people terribly. So there is the current account, there is the capital account, there's the financial account. The capital account includes things called transactions in non-produced, non-financial assets. And that means things like patents and copyrights and trademarks. It also includes unimproved natural resources like land and stuff like that. And it also includes aid payments and debt forgiveness and things like that. So they've been separated out. That is what the IMF and so the Office of National Statistics now called the capital account. It is a tiny thing. It's of no significance, as you can imagine. I mean, if we're just talking about patents and one or two things like that. So what everyone used to call the capital account is now the financial account, and the financial account includes net direct investments. So if you buy property directly, or if you buy up more than 10% of the shares in a company, in which case you're seen as having a controlling influence, that's classified as direct investment. There's portfolio investment. So if you just buy shares as part of an investment portfolio, or if you buy, for that matter, corporate or government bonds. There's other investments, which amongst other things include bank deposits. They're all included in the financial account. So forgetting the complications before, let's stick them all together and call them the capital and financial account. If Britain is running a current account deficit, then it has a capital and financial account surplus. What that means is the rest of the world is net lending to or net making financial investments in the UK. The UK as a whole, private sector and government, is accumulating net financial liabilities to the rest of the world, is net borrowing from the rest of the world. But the current account and the capital and financial account have to sum to zero. And once you include a balancing item, because the statistics are all wrong, because things get misestimated or missed out entirely or put in the wrong time period, then they come to a zero. You have a naught at the bottom.
Got it.
So current account deficit means capital and financial account surplus. In MMT, we call that the foreign sector surplus.
Great stuff. All right, that's really nailed that, I think, for me. Just so that people could visualize capital flows.
Yes. You're going to ask me what capital is?
No. Let me ask it this way and see if this is a better way to ask it. And then, you can answer it any way you like. In order for there to be a capital inflow to the UK,
yes,
what has to happen in the real world?
In order for there to be a capital inflow to the UK simply needs to be running a current account deficit. If you're running a current account deficit, by definition, you've got a capital inflow.
But who buys what? From who? Just one example of this is an example of capital flowing into the UK. Yeah.
Even if a foreign resident holds a bank deposit in the UK, that counts as a capital inflow. But They could also, they could take that bank deposit and they could buy shares in a British company, or they could buy a real asset, they could buy a building, or they could lend to Christian Riley, who could sign an IOU. All of those things would be...
I'd much prefer a unilateral transfer, but, let's go with your thing.
Absolutely. Well, when people talk about capital flows, really they're just talking about the net lending or net borrowing between countries, essentially.
Yeah.
It's nothing more complicated than that.
I was going to say, what would be an example of a capital outflow from the UK? So, what would a person or a firm do to create a capital outflow?
Put some money in a foreign bank account, or
that's it.
Lend to somebody overseas, which is what you're doing if you put money in a foreign bank account because you're lending to a foreign bank, or buy shares in a German company, or set up a subsidiary of your company in Japan, or buy an apartment in Spain, or buy US government debt, anything like that.
Great, that's brilliant. So now the huge question is, okay, what is capital in that context?
That word capital has been used in so many different contexts in economics.
Yeah.
It's even worse than even worse than trying to answer what is capitalism. But capital, when you start studying economics, as an undergraduate anyway, or at school, then in the first week, they talk about the factors of production. And one of the factors of production they call capital. And they tell you that that's plant, equipment, machinery, buildings, goods that you can use to produce more goods. So that's one meaning of the word capital. At the same time, you might be doing an accounting course. If you're doing an accounting course, they'll show you a balance sheet, and it'll have real and financial assets on one side of the balance sheet, and those real assets are what the economist was telling you was capital in the previous class you did the last hour. And on the other side of the balance sheet, you've got your liabilities or debts. And if you do the value of your assets minus your liabilities, you've got something in the bottom right-hand corner of the balance sheet that the accountant will call capital. But that doesn't quite mean the same thing this time, because it's the difference between the value of assets and liabilities. And then maybe later on you'll do an investment theory course or something like that. And people talk about shares and equity capital, and you're talking about financial assets then, which might sort of mean you own some real assets because you're part owner of a company. But actually, we're not talking about those real assets. You're talking about shares, or they even talk about debt capital. If you buy corporate bonds, then you're investing in debt capital. And then in another class, they might talk about education and training, and they'll tell you you're investing in your human capital. And then they'll talk about in international trade, there'll be trade deals, and they'll talk about intellectual capital. So by the time you finish, you've seen the word capital used in God knows how many different ways. Most of them have got something to do with owning something that's going to allow you to generate an income, or that's going to provide you with a flow of services over time. But they all mean kind of different things. I think the classical economists thought of capital as physical capital, and then along comes Karl Marx, and suddenly it means something financial instead, and it's meant lots of things.
Okay.
So again, I said there wasn't going to be a very good answer.
No, it's a great answer. But when people talk about, let's say John Harvey talks about the thing that really influences exchange rates, if I'm remembering right, are capital flows.
Yes.
And so what is capital in that context?
Speculative capital flows. Large amounts of liquidity. What do I mean by liquidity? Basically bank deposits and money market assets. So you might buy treasury bills or similar private sector securities that there's an active secondary market in, but actually that are going to mature soon. In any case, you might tie money up for a few days. And if you are a currency trader, it might be your job just to make investments between 3 or 4 currencies. And perhaps your employer has given you position limits. So there's a limit to the extent you can put everything in one currency or another. But what are you doing every day? Every day you're waking up and you're looking on your feed for what are the main news items coming up that day. And you're thinking, okay, the governor of the Bank of England is going to do a speech. There's some US trade statistics coming out, and there's some financial statistics coming out from the European Central Bank. What time are they coming out? What do I think is going to happen? If what I think happens actually does happen, what do I think other people are going to do in terms of trading the currencies at that time? How confident am I this is actually going to happen? Do I want to change my positions? Well, okay, yes, I do. I'll move a bit more from euros into US dollars.
The beauty contest.
Because of what I think might happen later on in the day, because I think the exchange rate might change. And I'm not just thinking about that. If you get around reading John's book, I'm just more or less repeating John's book now, then I'm maybe looking 7 days ahead when I'm making these decisions. Tomorrow, I'll be thinking whether I made the right decision today or not, and I'll be shifting things around again. So I rarely perhaps look 7 days into the past, but I'm trying maybe to look 7 days into the future. And I move funds around. And if I do move funds into US dollars, I could just leave them on deposit somewhere, or I could buy some treasury bills with them. I'm looking for the best return I can get. If I tie the money up over a few days, there is a risk the exchange rates might move against me. So I'm trying to take all those things into account. This is what is sometimes called hot money or speculative capital flows. And really, since foreign exchange controls started properly coming down, Britain was just about the first country to completely eliminate them in 1979. But rich countries scrapped them during the 80s, and some not rich countries were foolishly followed suit later on. But the foreign exchange market absolutely massively expanded, so that now there's over $5 trillion every day traded on the global foreign exchange market. And a trillion is one followed by 12 zeros. And where people imagine that if you've got a trade deficit, it means your currency must depreciate because, after all, you're selling more pounds because of all those imports you want to buy than anybody's buying because they want to buy your exports. What they're forgetting is that for the major traded currencies, there's 100 times as much being traded every day, at least, as what's got anything directly to do with exports and imports. Maybe that's overstating things a bit because foreign exchange risks get covered in international trade transactions. So maybe you need to divide that by 2 or something. But basically what happens to the pound, what happens to exchange rates, depends on what's going on in the heads of the majority of these guys working in Frankfurt or Singapore or London, which is the world's major foreign exchange trading place, or New York, day after day after day. And if they all decide to dump your currency, as I'm sure John would have said, then it'll depreciate. The reason why it'll depreciate is because the world's largest commercial investment banks act as market makers on the foreign exchange market. They keep inventories in all the major currencies anyway, and they continuously quote exchange rates at which they're prepared to buy and sell every pair of currencies on Reuters and on EBS, and which is another electronic network, and elsewhere. And if everybody starts selling pounds, buying US dollars, then these market makers find their inventories of pounds start going up and their inventories of dollars start going down. And so they look at what everybody else is doing as well, and they think, no, I don't think this is temporarily. I'm going to reduce the price of the pound. I'm going to increase the price of the dollar to try and balance things up because I don't want to accumulate lots and lots of pounds, especially when it looks like the pound is in the next few minutes, few hours, going to start losing value. And that's how exchange rates change. And if you go on to an online trading platform, you'll see that these quotes change every few seconds. I have had friends, some of my friends, well, 2 of them anyway, that I've had that have been involved in this are no longer with us. It's so stressful.
Wow.
I mean, they got sick, and I think sick because of the stress. If I was in London, you'd go out and you'd have a pizza with someone, and they wouldn't be paying attention, and they don't even want to sleep sometimes because they're worried. This is a 24-hour a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year market. They're worried about what's going to happen if they've got open positions while they're asleep. Terrible life. But this is what pushes currencies up and down.
Yeah, that sounds like a really stressful job.
Not for me.
But I guess hearing you describe it like that, and what I'm hearing is that the price or the value of the pound versus in relation to other currencies around the world is not so much to do with our economy, with the strength of the economy per se, but with what capital or people who have a large amount of capital believe it's going to happen, or their opinion matters.
Yeah, they're not trading their own money generally. They're working for big financial institutions. But yeah, it's like well, I don't know. I don't want to be mean about them either. They might be. One guy I knew who wasn't directly involved in this, but was linked to it. Ended up being a Greens parliamentary candidate in the UK. So the people just get drawn into these jobs. But what I'm saying is, a super intelligent person who has just done the qualification Patricia is about to do might find themselves being drawn into this kind of lifestyle.
Well, the institutions would seek you out specifically because they perceive you having those skills, and you know, the money that comes with it, even the lifestyle. Besides the stress, it can be alluring to a lot of people. But the thing I wanted to say is that those capital movements, which are speculative, are indeed, this is an unproductive side of the economy.
Exactly. Absolutely. I agree entirely. And I also agree. Christian was talking about the beauty contest metaphor from Keynes, which was about the stock market, which I think was in the general theory. It might have been in one of the other papers he wrote at the time. I can't remember now. But it is pretty much like that. A currency will depreciate if these people think that it should depreciate. Yeah. Now, they're making their decisions based partly on economic fundamentals. They are looking at the economic news, but they also use, very heavily used on the foreign exchange market, what's sometimes called technical analysis or chartism that makes no economic sense at all. They look for...
It's like astrology.
Yeah, that's right. But it's astrology that works. Yeah. And the reason why it works is that enough people think it works.
Yeah. It almost doesn't matter whether the theories are right or wrong as long as people think they are.
Well, if they are, in short term, then they appear to be. But all these guys say when they're making longer term decisions, they look at economic fundamentals. But when they're looking at shorter term decisions, they look at things like technical analysis and things like resistance levels too. Mm-hmm. When a currency gets to... When the Australian dollar was very strong, about 2011, the early part of the commodities boom, when it went above $1, it went up close to $1.1, but it just never went over 1.1. And you know why? It's because they see that they talk about that as a resistance level. And it's a big thing if an important financial price goes over a resistance level. Of course, there's nothing particularly special about 1.1 as opposed to 1.098657 or something, but people just think it does. These things play a role on the foreign exchange market, and so you're entirely right. A bad set of trade statistics could affect the value of the pound, but it isn't directly because of transactions relating to trade. It's because there are enough speculators out there that think it should affect the value of the pound, and they think that because they think their mates think it.
And the thing is that when you see it within that context and you understand why the ideological force coming behind that in the 1970s, which was effectively about taking power away from governments and having the market or these capital owners actually have the ability or a stronger power in keeping countries in check. Because then you see politicians, even well-meaning politicians like Corbyn and McDonnell falling prey to this fear of what the capital markets might do.
They do, and they're almost a bit behind the times, I think, now, because it's quite it's really not controversial anymore to say that there are circumstances when you might introduce foreign exchange controls, when you might stop people selling your currency, or to prevent instability, limit the range of financial assets that foreign residents can buy in the first place, which used to be very widespread. So there were tight foreign exchange controls in place everywhere up until the 1970s. And they only gradually came down from the late 1970s onwards, and that's when this market took off. I don't think this is so important as far as the UK is concerned, but I think for currencies which are more prone to big movements because of speculation, the Turkeys and Argentinas, actually Argentina has used foreign exchange controls again now. Macri should never have got rid of the foreign exchange controls in the first place. Of course, they've got far more problems than just the foreign exchange market. And the government is in charge of the monetary system in the end, if it wants to be. And there are things to be concerned about. I mean, if you limit the ability of institutions to take funds out of your monetary system, and included in that is the repatriation of dividends, and if you want foreign multinationals to invest in your economy in the first place, then you're going to deter them from doing so, that kind of thing. Or if there is discussion about foreign exchange controls being introduced which stop people selling your currency or limit their ability to do so, then of course it's going to cause a stampede. But there are circumstances when it might be appropriate to use foreign exchange controls. You have to be careful when you discuss that, though, because people then imagine that you're advocating that the UK should. And I don't think it's necessary for Britain to do so. I'm not really talking about Britain there.
If we do advocate for ending these speculative movements, which is a form of capital control, right? And what would be the main backlash against that? What would be the main argument against that?
I'm not exactly sure what we do advocate for. We certainly advocate for eliminating some speculation on financial markets. Mm-hmm. And there are a whole phalanx of completely pointless derivatives products which exist only for people to speculate in them. But as far as the foreign exchange market is concerned, it's a bit different. There are things I don't know the answer to. I don't know the answer. I'll leave that to brainier people than me.
Okay.
Would it be an easier question to ask? Could you give us an example of a useful type of speculation?
Yeah.
Well, speculation, you can imagine circumstances when it might help to stabilise things. If a currency is seen to have become undervalued because of a panic, then a smart speculator might come and buy. That's the neoclassical argument.
Yeah. A self-correcting mechanism.
That's right, yeah.
Right, yeah.
But the trouble is sometimes that it's difficult to separate out what is speculation from what isn't.
Right, okay.
And that's true with derivatives too, because you can use derivatives to speculate for profit, but you can also use at least some derivatives, including on the foreign exchange market, to hedge exchange rate risk. And so not all derivatives transactions are bad. And it's then not always simple. I mean, some of them obviously are, but at the margin, it's not simple determining what it is worth restricting or eliminating and what should be allowed to continue. The simpler and more transparent derivatives are, the better, I think.
Got it. Okay.
But as far as the foreign exchange market is concerned, if you stop people freely buying and selling pounds, then there will be implications for that, which are not directly about speculative risk-taking and profit-seeking. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean.
All right. So we had a question about all this kind of stuff from one of our patrons, Howell, who's a really smart guy, asks great questions. And he writes, okay, according to the HMRC's 2019 data on UK trade with non-EU countries, 70% of such imports are invoiced in US dollars. is this a cause for concern with respect to our monetary sovereignty? So to sum up, imports are priced in US dollars, but we've got pounds. So can we talk about monetary sovereignty in that context?
Well, monetary sovereignty is really compromised only when the monetary sovereign government borrows in foreign currency.
Okay.
If you are a small, low-income economy with a very narrow range of exports and a currency which, if it was floating, would be prone to big fluctuations and potentially a catastrophic depreciation, and you are very heavily dependent on imported basic necessities, which people who are already on the margin of subsistence are relying on being able to afford, then you certainly have very heavily compromised monetary sovereignty, and you can quite understand why the majority of those countries try to fix their currency against the US dollar, even though that then often creates a chronic debt problem because they end up borrowing US dollars in order to try and support a chronic trade deficit that they find it very difficult to get out of, and that's how they end up in the embrace of the IMF and having to throw those poor people under the bus. And Fadel talks about this quite a lot when he talks about building food sovereignty and energy sovereignty, amongst other things, in those countries. And Ndongo Silla, he writes very well about this as well. You know, the world is not a fair place, but it doesn't apply to Britain in the same way that it applies to those kind of countries. If the pound depreciates significantly on the foreign exchange market, well, even where things are invoiced in US dollars, foreign suppliers still have the option of absorbing part of the impact of the depreciation in the pound on UK customers by simply cutting the US dollar prices that they invoice. So you're not going to get 100% exchange rate pass-through even under those circumstances. But to the extent that there is that exchange rate pass-through when imports are invoiced in US dollars, as they will tend to be, because, of course, the dollar is pretty much the global currency still, even to this day, then that could mean some upward pressure on the UK price level. But in some cases, for reasons that we actually don't welcome. The way that the UK economy works these days, the precariousness with which many people have employment and the lack of bargaining power on the supply side of the labour market, and the fact that trade unions have little or no bargaining power, even where people are members of trade unions in many cases, means that it wouldn't turn into, not the way the UK is at the moment, it's not going to turn into persistent inflation, because for it to turn into persistent inflation, it would need then to put upward pressure on labour costs, and that's just most unlikely at the moment. It would be better in a future where people, had more bargaining power at work and were not faced with precarious employment, where once again it was more difficult potentially for the government to avoid increased import prices having a persistent impact on inflation. There are lots of reasons why that would be a better world to go back to, but the way we are at the moment, it wouldn't. So the worst thing that could happen, currency depreciation could push the price of some things up a bit in the UK. The cost of living would increase. And that's a one-off thing, though. That would be a one-off fall in people's real incomes. It wouldn't compromise the ability of the government to pursue full employment if that's what the government was trying to do. And under present circumstances, there's no reason to believe it would be inflationary, because inflation isn't a small one-off increase in the price level. It's a continuous increase in prices over time.
A thing that gets lost sometimes when we talk about what happens if something dramatic happens in the exchange rate to imports is the people selling the imports to the UK want to sell that stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Are they going to let the exchange rate get in the way of that? They want the income.
If they're in competitive markets and if they're struggling to make sales, and even if their competitors are other foreign firms selling into the UK, if those other firms will absorb part of the cost, which tends to happen a lot anyway, because exchange rates are very volatile, and domestic retailers, even if at a wholesale level something's priced in US dollars, prices they don't get passed on all the time. Otherwise, if you're changing prices every day.
So anyway, this is the last question from Hal. It's about QE.
He makes good questions.
Hal writes, I'm comfortable with government bonds being considered equivalent to money, and so QE focused on gilts being little more than an asset swap. However, the BOE hasn't just been purchasing gilts, but also corporate bonds, which strikes me as a more drastic measure. So if corporations are swapping their own IOUs for settlement balances, does this mean net financial assets are being temporarily added to the non-government sector? And would it also mean corporate bond-focused QE involves central banks picking winners and losers?
Well, it could do, and in other countries it might. Well, some of that would be true, not all of it, but and in other countries that might be the case. But in the UK, I think, I might be wrong, but I think the Bank of England has been buying corporate bonds on the secondary market rather than on the primary market. They have bought some commercial paper, which is quantitatively much less important on the primary market. That's very short-term corporate debt. But as far as corporate bonds, they've been buying them second-hand. What are they doing when they buy corporate bonds? Well, they are not adding to the net financial assets of the private sector because they're lending to the private sector. And what happens in the end, if the Bank of England ends up with a corporate bond, that corporate bond is a debt of a private sector institution. Mm-hmm. Now, the Bank of England has always lent to the private sector, but previously they've lent only to financial institutions. If they buy corporate bonds, well, when they buy corporate bonds, then indirectly, even though they're buying them secondhand, they're lending to corporations. In terms of picking winners, I think if Hal goes on the Bank of England website, which I did about, a few minutes before we were talking, just to double check this, they restrict their purchases to ensure that they don't buy too many of any particular corporate bond. And they also try to avoid concentrating in these corporate bond purchases on a particular sector of the economy, a particular industry either. So they're not supposed to be picking winners. No, they're not adding to the net financial assets of the private sector because, yes, they're creating settlement balances, which is an asset for the private sector, but in return they're holding corporate bonds, which is a liability for the private sector, which in a way is like lending reserves to a bank.
Fair enough. And
it's going to have an impact, of course, because it has an impact on corporate bond prices. And so it pushes the yields on those corporate bonds down. And during a period of time when you might otherwise see a big increase in the yield spread between the rate of interest on government debt and on corporate debt, when everybody thinks corporations might all go bankrupt, but the government won't, then what this does is keeps that yield spread down. So it keeps the cost of finance to corporations lower than it otherwise would be, which is the purpose. Not that it's something that I would advocate doing, but that's, we'd have a different approach to these things, but that's what they're trying to do.
So they're trying to have an overall effect on the economy as opposed to trying to tilt the economy or favor certain actors.
I suppose they're trying to keep the cost of debt finance down for listed companies, and they hope that they're going to encourage those listed companies to still access the bond market, even if the Bank of England's not buying on the primary market, buying on the secondary market makes it easier for companies to raise funds on the primary market, and they'd be hoping to encourage some investment spending on that basis. I think it's a fairly forlorn hope because the problem is not funding corporate investment in the first place. The problem is, even if you don't have to close down, the problem is worrying about where your customers are going to be coming from and how you're going to be making a profit, I think. But yes, that's the purpose of it. The Japanese central bank has been for years been buying shares as well.
Right. And that's called yield curve control.
Yes.
In Japan, right? They're explicitly saying this is what we're doing.
Well, when you talk about yield curve control in Japan, Japan and Australia, that's happened to a certain extent in Australia now. In Japan, quantitative easing involving government bonds doesn't involve the Japanese central bank buying a fixed amount of them. Instead, they've set a target for the price on 10-year Japanese government bonds, and that target is a price at which the market interest rate, otherwise known as yield to maturity, on those 10-year government bonds is zero. So that's what they've maintained. But they've been doing that since 2016. They haven't just started.
Yeah.
In Australia, we've kind of copied them a bit, because in March, the Reserve Bank here started doing quantitative easing for the first time. But again, it doesn't involve the RBA buying a fixed amount of government bonds. Instead, they've just said the yield to maturity on 3-year government bonds is going to be 0.25%, and we're going to buy as many of them as we need when we need to in order to bring that about. In most other countries, central banks have not set an explicit target for a yield. Instead, they've just said, well, this is the quantity of bonds we're going to buy in advance.
Yeah, right. A lot of people go, first of all, QE is printing money. That's going to cause hyperinflation. And then years go by, it doesn't. It goes in the other direction. And then they look at, say, house prices and go, but it led to asset price inflation. So I was still right. It caused inflation. What I translate that as, okay, so if the government say, look, we're going to stop giving you free money for just having money, then people will go and invest that money somewhere that's not risk-free, like property or something like that. So in other words, this thing, investing money that's not risk-free, I'm pretty sure that's capitalism. So what they're complaining about is going, oh, you're forcing people to do capitalism. Anyway, that got a bit ranty.
It's the low interest rates. It's not the quantitative easing in themselves. It's the low interest rates on safe assets that does that. But whereas those low interest rates have, when you look at the research, they have had an impact on the stock market and indirectly on the economy. Most of that impact has been in different countries when it's been announced. So when you keep doing quantitative easing, when you've already done it for a while, it doesn't seem to have any further effect. It all seems to happen at the beginning. That's what the researchers tell us anyway.
Okay.
Be much more effective to use fiscal policy properly.
How many more years are going to go by before the penny drops on that? Is there anything you want to, just put out there before we sign off, or anything that Australians, need to know or get involved in?
If anybody in Australia in particular wants to be involved in the Sustainable Prosperity Action Group and all our various events, then they can contact me at Adelaide Uni. That's stephen.hale, Hail, at adelaide.edu.au, and I'll pass you on to Gabby, and she'll tell you all about the stuff that's going on in Adelaide, which continues to amaze me. Other than that, I'd just like to thank you and Patricia for all your fantastic work.
Thanks again, Stephen, as always.
Yeah, thanks for both of you. Great to see you both.
Likewise.
It's been a pleasure. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month, and get early access to all our episodes and patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino. And you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Editing and post-production was by Damien Caldwell. Thanks for listening.